Angouri's family and friends. Welcome to the inaugural lecture by Professor Joe Angouri. Joe, come back in a bit, you're hiding.
I'm thinking of leaving.
Somebody keep an eye on that door. My name is Professor Gwen van der Velden. I'm Warwick's Deputy Pro-Vice Chancellor for the Student Learning Experience. I'm also the Director of the Warwick International Higher Education Academy. I have the enormous honour to open this inaugural lecture, which has been organised jointly by the School of Modern Language and Cultures and the Warwick International Higher Education Academy. We're here today to celebrate and inaugurate one of our highly esteemed fellows of our academic community, who has excelled in learning and teaching leadership at the University of Warwick, nationally and internationally. And we made sure that she wore that gown, so you can't miss who it is. Recognition of academic distinction at any... Sorry.
I'll come back to that. It goes with the topic.
This is going to be the serious bit. So let me try this again. I do apologise. I'm sorry, Joe. I'll never live that down now. Okay.
It's because of the title.
Yes. Recognition of academic distinction at any level is a means of stating our values as an academic community and as part of the national and international community of scholars. Professorial recognition is a statement about the exceptionally high regard we have for a colleague, the quality of their achievements until the point of recognition, and also the expectations that we have on them for the future. By accepting the role of professor, we are also understood to accept and defend the academic principles of collegiality, academic freedom in research and teaching, and our interest in furthering the academic body of knowledge and the societies we live in. Professorial recognition is therefore not awarded lightly and deserves celebration. For example, through an inaugural lecture such as this. Of course, specifically when professorial recognition is awarded in part for teaching leadership, which is certainly the case in case of Joe, the lecture is perhaps even more an appropriate method to make a public statement. For those of us perhaps less acquainted with an event such as this, it may be helpful to set out the order of the event. During an inaugural lecture, the newly recognized professor has an opportunity to speak about any theme or topic of their academic interest. The lecture will always be given with the audience in mind, which is generally made up of interested colleagues and students, supportive family and friends, and interested members of the wider public. Before the inaugural professor starts their lecture, they will be introduced by a member of the senior management team of the University of Warwick, in this case, Pro-Vice Chancellor Education, Professor Chris Hughes. Thank you, Chris, for doing this. The inaugural professor will then speak on their chosen topic for around 40 minutes.
Around.
I'll keep an eye on you.
We negotiated.
No. And you are invited to ask any questions you may have. Questions for clarification are most welcome, as are invitations to debate and discuss. The question session will be chaired by Professor Emma Ushioda, Head of the School for Modern Languages and Cultures. Sorry?
Applied Linguistics.
So, I can't believe. Head of Cal. You will also give a short closing address and probably get more right than I just did. After these formal parts of the inaugural ceremony, you are invited to congratulate Professor Angouri over drinks, which will be made available outside the lecture theatre. I hope you will enjoy the inaugural lecture, and I would like to thank you in advance for your interest. I'm pleased to now hand over to Professor Chris Hughes, Pro-Vice Chancellor Education.
Okay, thank you, Gwen. Thanks. Okay, so now I have the great pleasure of introducing Professor Joe Angouri, our speaker today. I first met Jo when she joined Warwick in December 2014 as then an associate professor in the Centre of Applied Linguistics, Gwen. Cal. Jo was a research hire and was also given the responsibility for designing and leading a significant new area of growth for the department, the development of Cal's first undergraduate provision. Under her leadership, and in only 4 years, the Cal UG programmes were in place and came top in the UK league tables in their very first entry. Quite an extraordinary achievement. Likewise, Jo's career trajectory has been rather extraordinary, I think. Since finishing her PhD, she has gone on to break new ground in terms of theory, methods, analytical approaches, and produce a veritable storm of publications, reaching the status of full professor and a senior academic leader in a remarkably and truly impressive short period of time. Jo is an outstanding sociolinguist and critical discourse analyst, and her work is exceptional in quality, depth, and breadth. Okay, I need to take a breath for this one. She has published extensively with over 60 refereed papers, 3 special issues, 2 books, 4 edited volumes, and 2 conference proceedings. She is the founding editor of the Multilingual Matters Language at Work series and co-editing Discourse Approaches to Politics, Society and Culture, a flagship series for John Benjamin's. Jo has been a visiting scholar in institutions in New Zealand, Australia and Europe, and is currently a visiting distinguished professor at Aalto University, School of Business, Finland. She works for research councils in the UK and overseas. Her impact is exceptional and she has given over 80 fully funded, invited talks at leading institutions in Europe, the USA, Australia, Hong Kong and New Zealand in the last 10 years alone. Jo is co-directing 2 international research networks, one under our own Warwick Monash Alliance on migration, identity and translation, and one on migrants in working life. She has also recently developed a consortium of academics, NGOs and professional organisations for a large international project on refugee resettlement, transition and language, involving international partners in Australia, Canada and New Zealand. And this is a bit I really like. Instead of talking multidisciplinarity, Jo actually does it. She's one of the few linguists who has been collaborating with non-academic stakeholders in different fields nationally and internationally, from medicine and international business to policy, education, and back to linguistics. Jo's work has addressed the complexity of language and boundary crossing, fitting in the modern workplace, and she's working on institutional interaction, political discourse, and ideology. She also focuses very much on student engagement, and it's great to see so many students here tonight, internationalisation of higher education, and pedagogic innovation. As often seems to happen with internationally high-achieving researchers, Jo is also a celebrated teacher, educator, and supervisor, and has fully embraced university leadership. She holds the position of Director of Undergraduate Studies in Cal and supervises 10 PhD students, with an impressive 7 completions in the last 10 years. And, this is how I'm working mostly with Jo at the moment, Jo now has a university-level role in the internationalisation of the education strategy. And this is all apart from being an elected member of Senate and sitting on a very wide range of university committees. So Jo does an awful lot, but a well-kept secret is that she has mastered time travel, which means she is now always simultaneously available somewhere in the world, even whilst travelling. But despite all this responsibility, Jo is still full of innovative ideas, full of energy and full of enthusiasm. No one believes us when we say that she never sleeps. I think she doesn't, but if she does, then I think she must simultaneously design new programmes, write papers, submit grant applications and answer emails, all while asleep, I think, possibly. Okay, so we do need to take care of Jo. She works extremely hard, so she does need to learn to sleep. Okay. Jo's enthusiasm and energy is infectious, and her many collaborators, postgraduate and undergraduate students, find working with her to be a life-affirming experience, producing work of great value. So I'm really delighted to welcome Jo as an outstanding and field-leading scholar, an exceptional educator, and a great ongoing collaborator, and I think a really true asset to Warwick. So Jo's keynote tonight is entitled, Those Prejudices Run Deep, which is why language matters. So please join me in welcoming Jo to speak tonight.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gwen and Chris. for this wonderful and humbling introduction. I'm deeply honored, and I also feel I need a holiday. So, Chris, I'm going to come and negotiate that after the lecture. Before I start, I would like to thank you to WIHEA for the privilege and honor to speak to you today about matters that I deeply care and feel passionate about. And Gwen and Michelle Kulpa, who is somewhere here, who organized everything in this complex operation. I would also like to send a very big thank you to my department, the Centre for Applied Linguistics, and our head of department, Professor Emma Ushioda, who invited you all here today, and Emily Rycroft, the departmental administrator, who organized everything so efficiently and also, as always, in style and elegance. Thank you very much. Thank you to you all for being here, colleagues and friends from all times and new. You also need to be congratulated because you passed the first test we always give to anybody visiting us here at Warwick, which is to find the building and the room. So congratulations, you performed very well, and on that note, I'm going to take my hat off to you all. So that solves this matter, I think. Right, okay, so I'm leaving the rest on, that's fine. So, what I'm going to do in the next 40 minutes or so, no more than 45 precise, is to start by positioning my discipline and what linguists do. This is a selfish moment, as many of those nearest and dearest to me still have very little grasp of the discipline. So I thought this is the perfect moment to settle this forever. I will then share some current work, some current research on the relation between language and social justice, particularly work I was doing in relation to the refugee resettlement agenda. And I'm going to then turn to the implications and the social relevance of our research and teaching and some thoughts about academic praxis in the current socio-political context. So, and then we will have time for discussion, which will continue over some alcohol, which will be waiting for us right outside. So, what do linguists do? I'm going to test you later, but an insight into the perception of the discipline is what happens when one is introduced as a linguist. Try it when you're at your next dinner party and you want to see and try if I'm right. So when you are introduced as a linguist, that triggers a number of very common questions, which I have summarized from you here. The figure in the middle is supposed to be me. So what is actually happening here is that the financial crisis has taken its toll. So those who are a bit suspicious would say, can you really make a living? Or who needs that? However, more frequently, you're seen as either an 18th century grammarian, so people think that you do something with a kind of some sort of policing language use, or you are seen as a walking translation machine, which can also make fantastically clever etymological nature comments, and you get the all-time classics question, which is how many languages do you speak? When you're presented with this question, you need to give a number larger than 10 to meet the expectation of your interlocutor. Okay, so naively thought that this was the lay people's representation of the discipline concerning human languages of past and present. And if you, my fellow linguists, think that it is bad, the questions you have, if you're of Greek origin, you're also presented with random questions or words in ancient Greek or Latin, and you're expected to say something to that. Hollywood, however, has also expanded it further and pushed the last frontier. So if you've been to the cinema relatively recently and you like the sci-fi genre, then you know what happens when gigantic spaceships come to Earth, and of course the US Army, who of course is always around and in charge, seeks help. Now, this will always be help from a linguist, and look what happens when someone appears to this linguist's office. So the expression expressions on the face are very important. The desperation of the linguist applies, right? Even when it is about human languages. So I like the fact that you laugh at these lay misconceptions, but do we know our linguists? So linguists are not of the same type. Although we are a very big, happy family concerned with language, this wonderful set of resources that we all use in our daily lives, we are going to focus today on one of the most beautiful species of the family, which is the sociolinguists. So these beautiful species are concerned with the way we interact with the world around us. Through language, we enact who we are, where we belong, how we want to be seen, what type of identities we claim or reject. Simultaneously, however, there are constraints that limit this agency. For example, in this lecture, I have a set of options that I can choose how to present my inaugural to you in terms of formality, in terms of tone, in terms of standing still, in terms of coming closer. Having said that, there is also a set of expectations that you brought with you and a set of constraints in this formal event. If I decide to break those expectations and change the norms, then there is a penalty that I will need to pay. And I want us to be introduced to this concept of the penalty, and we're going to actually see a bit more on that. Now, within the field of sociolinguistics, an even newer and more beautiful family started growing in the 80s, looking into language and work, so the sociolinguists of work. Work is particularly important: personal well-being, social mobility, social growth, and so on. So it has been a very important domain for linguists to turn their attention to. Having said that, the capitalist economy, process of commodification, marketization of society, these are all around us, gave the field a much wider remit, one that moved from the workplace as a site of investigation to looking into how globalization, capitalism, new forms of work apply across domains of human activity. So in that context, myself and others have looked into the way teams make decisions and solve problems in a range of contexts, and I've researched a whole range from large multinationals, institutional context, medical emergencies, to SMEs and family businesses. Some colleagues from this line of this work are here with us today. The field has been primarily concerned with issues around identity and role, and what I have been very interested in is in the relationship of policy and practice. An extension of my interest on policy and the political of language is what I'm going to share with you today, which is research on mobility and migration, and we're going to look into it specifically through the refugee integration into the labor market and therefore liquid societal integration. So I'm going to share some work, and I'm going to focus specifically on work that I have been doing and came out last year, and this one is work that we're currently doing with colleagues from Finland and Canada. What I'm hoping to show and convince you today, if you're not convinced, is that language matters, and it does much, much more, and the discipline does much more than providing a human version of Google Translate with some sort of etymological type of insights. So let's turn to one domain where language work and social justice has been immediately visible. The migrant worker, who has taken so much publicity in the so-called refugee crisis. And I don't have time to unpack those terms, but the term crisis is a very political and a very problematic one because it implies wrongdoing and some victims and perpetrators. And in this case, the refugees are certainly not either. They are not the perpetrators, they're certainly the victims. So if we actually take a look into what happens into the relevant press, we actually see that language is foregrounded in migrant integration within and outside the academic sociolinguistic agenda. Through this is the from the UK, so this is The Guardian, and what we have on the title here is that language barrier leaves refugees facing struggle to rebuild their lives. And we're going to actually start unpacking how language is understood, framed, conceptualized, and what are the implications and the complexity surrounding this. Now, although my point of reference would be the UK, through the two networks that Chris introduced earlier, we have the same evidence from places all around the world around the issues that I'm going to raise tonight. So let's start unpacking this, and let's look into some of those issues. Don't try to read the slide. The graphs are for decorative purposes. What you, however, have is two quotes. The one above is from the Home Office in 2010, and the one at the bottom is the APPG in 2017. And what they both say is that English language skills, in our case, when it's the UK, are very important for refugee integration. Those who have those skills perform better than those who don't. Okay, nobody questions that. All right, let's start with the fact that yes, having access to the language of the majority is important. Okay, but we're going to just start saying what else is hiding there. And what the APPG says is that access to the language of the majority should be part of the strategy, and it is a right for those who live in this country. So there is agreement that language proficiency is important and therefore is a top priority for integration programs in many places around the world. It is often prerequisite for refugees to be able to access benefit and support, which is necessary, of course, in order to resettle. So what is language here? And let's start taking the various layers. So first of all, it is technical ability in English language skills. Refugees need to access that. It is a prerequisite. It is something we all agree is important. However, there are a whole range of different barriers. What you have here is a report from Refugee Action, basically saying one of the things that is echoed in all projects that I have seen, either me being part of or supervised or in any capacity involved in, which is that language provision is not fit for purpose. So anybody who has taught knows that if we take our group of learners as a homogeneous group with one set of needs, this is not going to work. The other barrier, and those both are in the eye of the media, is that there is a very long wait because offer and demand are not aligned. So what you have here, again, don't try to read the whole report, is that this report shows the range of barriers that are in place, and there is very good linguistic work to show that this is indeed the case. So these are just some quotes from 2019, so projects that are running right now. One basically is from a teacher volunteer who says, how can we actually lump together a highly educated woman with someone who is struggling with basic literacy? And the same is echoed from those taking the classes. Now, the reason why this map is getting more and more complex is that funding drops. So although increase in demand and so on, funding drops, and at the same time, we know that civil society has stepped in, there are a number of volunteers involved, and it's very difficult to map where is this provision, how can we actually access it, who is responsible for what is the content and so on. Now, this is where it starts guessing where I want us to actually go, because this is the background. If you think that this is the serious stuff, it's not. This is the first level. Within that, when we talk about language, there is a lot of talk about values. Okay, and you have seen that a lot in the press. This is just one example, and it's not only the UK. This is from the BBC article, is about Finland, and it refers to a program for teaching migrants how to behave. So values, and in this case, British values, is very prominent in this discourse, as we're going to see in some slides further down. Now, if I were to lock the doors, I'm not going to do that, don't worry, and have us all as a group to decide what are the British values that should go in those language classes for this heterogeneous group of people who are often lumped together under unhelpful labels such as migrants, sometimes refugees, sometimes economic migrants, and this fuzziness is exploited, it would be very difficult. So anybody who has done work on values knows how complex, deeply political, and ideological it is. So we start seeing how, when we talk about language, we have a whole range of complexities that are immediately mobilized without necessarily making this explicit. So Bourdieu, those of you who had the fortune, or misfortune, I don't know, to be taught, I think the fact that you're here today is a good sign, I'm taking that, knows that I very much like Bourdieu. and Bourdieu has talked about the capital, the language capital. So the way I present myself to you linguistically, and I want us to get to the space where we think about language as more than the set of words, as the embodiment of my performance, the way I enact and construct and I use all those resources that I have is capital that I have. And I know what you expect, not because someone gave me a handout or a handbook, is because of a lot of knowledge that I have accumulated over the years. And that makes me competent in being able to recognize and act or not according to the norms that apply to any encounter like today's inaugural. In that case, I can be what Bourdieu says, a fish in the water, and we have alignment. So your body language, the fact that you laugh, the fact that you're not on your phones, your fact that you actually see eye contact shows me that we are engaged. Okay, so that's very good. What happens when we are not, however, is that there is a penalty to be paid. And Celia Roberts introduced the term linguistic penalty, talking about the disadvantage linguistic minority groups face, particularly in the context of accessing the job market, and I'll come back to that, which leads them to fare less well in selection events such as job interviews. Celia expanded work by Heath and Chung on the disadvantage and discrimination in employment that minority groups face, so the ethnic penalty, and they have written very nicely on the snow peaks, which I think we can still see in organizations of any type in many parts of the world around how access is given and so on. So we're going to actually look into that in a little bit more detail, and I'm going to take you with me on this journey of looking into language from different angles. One first level is to see about ideology, and this is very important, the ideologies that are there and circulate in the current socio-political context where we see fear, nationalization, populism, far right on the right. And here on the right. And here I want to refer to the work of my very good colleague, collaborator and friend, Ruth Wodak, who has written on the politics of fear. If anybody hasn't come across her work, I highly, highly recommend it. So what we do, and what I've been doing, and I want to share some of this work with you, which is very much kind of a project that it is happening right now, is to analyze policy discourse documents. Media discourse, political discourse has attracted a lot of attention. What I wanted to see is what happens in policy discourse in relation to language and work, and in the context of refugees in this case. So what you have here is a sample list of reports we analyzed, which come from a whole range of different bodies, and these different bodies have very different agendas, right? So if you are the Refugee Council, you have a different job, a different role, a different remit to being the Home Office, of course. So what I wanted to see is how refugees, which are always a plural group, okay, are syntactically and semantically positioned. Are they the agents of actions? Are they recipients? Where are those people? Now, what you have here is that, I'm sure you won't be surprised, is that refugees are rarely in subject position. When that happens, it's mainly in relation to demographics. They're typically in object position, so you have things like public opinion is skeptical about hiring refugees, or the examples you have. And where they are in subject position, what you actually have is examples such as refugees are given the protection they need, so we're receiving action. Okay? The way action is represented is very important. I'm going to show you a couple of slides on that in a second. We also looked into the metaphors that are used in the policy reports, and what you actually have on the right here is the wave and flow, the liquid metaphor, which you see everywhere in the populist rhetoric. Okay? So this liquid and container metaphor is very problematic because we have this sort of analogy of the country as a container. If we keep pouring, then it will flow, it will burst, terrible things will happen. Okay. Within that, you have core discourses that represent refugees as a challenge or a problem, and recipients of support, service, benefits, and so on. And this is across, which is quite interesting. I was not expecting that. I was expecting that in the context of the commodified economy, there would be a strong discourse of refugees as a resource, aging demographics, skill shortage, and so on. This, however, is very, very rare. We found only one reference, and when this happens in the report we analyzed, this is not going into the detail that the other categories that we saw. I want to refer here to the very good work Markus Reindorf is doing with colleagues in Austria, and they have analyzed a large corpus representing refugees' actions in EU press releases, and they compared those with an Austrian corpus, and you see, if you can read a little bit, the sort of the different representations of actions, and this is the areas where we actually have overlap with policy documents. Turning to the UK government policy discourse, what we actually have here is values again. So Britain's tolerance. Tolerance is a very good word, of course. We all want to be tolerant people. Those of you who were taught by me know that I'm very skeptical and critical of these big words. So if tolerance means that I have to tolerate you because you're deviant to my norm, which is mine, but it's all right, I will tolerate until you change so that you can fit in to what I expect, it is slightly less than what we want to pride ourselves in terms of being a very tolerant society. There is an emphasis on the integration at the local level, and it's true that success stories come at the local level. However, this is policy, and policy also comes with accountability and resource, and there are some very important and deep questions about whose responsibility is what. And you start remembering what I said very briefly about language classes, civil society stepping in, who does what, when, and so on. There is a whole range of issues there that I think need to be discussed, questioned, and how they're enacted, the language or the discourses there, if you prefer, are very important. There's a lot of emphasis on values, and there are a number of issues here, but because I don't have time, I'm only going to talk to the fact that we now have another layer of fuzziness, which is citizenship. So all of a sudden, the life in the UK, and I see colleagues from sociology here, there is a very good discussion around what tests such as the life in the UK actually do. And all of a sudden, citizenship processes become parts of integration and becomes part of ways of understanding the democratic principles, understanding British society. The evidence we have over the years from a number of different projects, including my students who every other year, if not every year, they do a project taking those tests and subjecting them to those who would be the ones who were supposed to perform well without having to do any preparation, if those tests are what we need in everyday conversation. Someone who has spent all their life in the social context where this test applies should perform well. However, we know that actually those fail. Okay, so the issue here is, what do those tests actually do? Who designed them? For what reason? What are they? What is their purpose? And so on. So if we want to strengthen the language through getting through a citizenship process, which in the first place we know that doesn't quite work the way it's supposed to work, there is a whole range of issues there that need to be unpacked in order to be addressed. And of course, there is the usual emphasis on challenges that come with refugees and migrants, and you have the same wave metaphors. Now, I need to go, because this is still not really where I want to be, right? So I need to actually zoom on. But I also want to say, this is just a bit of rant on the tolerance. That the refugee integration is also seen from a particular perspective. I'm not moralizing this as good or bad, I can do that, but it's very important to think that integration and contribution to society is measured, the indicator, the index, is a 9 to 5 paid job for a firm. Now, we can unpack this, and a number of feminist scholars, and I see some in this room, they know how much effort has been put and how much work we still need to do for contribution to society to be acknowledged on the basis of what's caring, family, what happens at community level, school, and so on. So there is a whole range of assumptions there, and there is a whole range of stances and positions that are not necessarily as straightforward as they're often presented to be. Okay, now, what actually happens when we need to negotiate specifically gatekeeping events, right? So when we are in an encounter, what happens when we are in this context like what is happening in this inaugural? And these are moments of transition. These are moments of negotiating who is in and who stays out. And we're going to talk job interviews. So I want us all in this room, irrespective of whether we have anything to do with refugees, to start thinking of the last job interview that we either conducted ourselves or we took as interviewees. So refugees, and economic migrants for that matter, going through job interviews, we know that they systematically fail to produce the right story. Interviews are a set of stories. Tell me an example of, can you remember a time? What would you do if? And so on, okay? Producing the right story, there is no little handbook that actually says, this is what you need, this is what is expected. It is, again, all the knowledge that we have been accumulating over the years. Also, those coming new to a socio-linguistic, political environment don't know how to manage interpersonal relationships. How formal do you want me to be? How informal? How do I show being formal? How do I show my respect to you? Okay, is it my body? Is it my position? What is it? And therefore, they typically and systematically, in all the projects we have seen, fail to strike the appropriate balance between formality and informality. They don't display competence in the way that we, the majority, expect to see competence displayed. Okay, so I see my students leaning, I see people taking notes, I see this sort of alignment here, this is important. So my performance matches your expectations. That's wonderful, but this is one way that we share. It's not the only way. And what you actually see on the right is work by Celia Roberts in 2013 that actually shows that white British, ethnic minority British, consistently perform better than those born abroad in selection interviews. And we're talking about low-paid migrant positions here. So competence is complex, and going back to where we began, if you remember we started and we said, of course, language is important. Of course, technical ability in the language is important. But in order to do anything that has to do with integration, there is so much more that is actually happening. And this is where it's interesting. I'm going to show you, don't stretch your eyes, I'm going to read through this with you. So this is one of my favorite, because it's concise in showing the exact issues that are at stake here. The data is from an integration initiative for refugees and migrants in Denmark, and it is work that we have been doing with my good colleague Marta Kirilova there. And what we have here is a typical example of what interviewees, what refugees going through those processes do, which is to do a lot of hard work to address what they know is already in place before them, which is the ideologies and the representations of the other. So what we have here is someone going through this process who is associated with a group that has taken a lot of publicity in the press and shows awareness that issues around behaviors such as alcohol consumption, supposed gender equality, and that's because I don't want to ratify our societies as having reached gender equalities, okay, are an issue. So what the interviewee does is to say, at some point to the interviewer, I'm solicited to start going into a personal narrative of I'm from a family that with woman and man there is equality, there is no problem. this is very difficult. If you are in a job interview and you've been into that space of bringing equality into your family, you need very good skills to get out of there, right? Okay. And it continues, okay? So we have the alcohol. This is Denmark. How are you going to be part of our social events? Do you fit, really? So we also, my wife, when we have a party, birthday, we put in front, we have a glass of wine or something, but I drink vodka or something else. It's not a problem. Now, we can see what is actually happening here. This is systematic. We have evidence from a whole range of different contexts. But actually, instead of bridging the perceived difference, what is actually happening is further misalignment. And we actually see misalignment between the interviewer and the interviewee spiraling. And the more the gap widens, the more difficult it is, right? So the more we actually, the more you think, oh, I'm not comfortable, you're challenging my expectations here, the more difficult it is to reverse that. So we find that in a whole range of different projects, and I don't have time to go through that, but what I wanted to say is that social representation and stigma is very visible in factors that are associated with exclusion in a whole range of different projects which involve narratives or data of this type. So back to Bourdieu, who, as I warned you, I like very much, who actually said very, very accurately that linguistic competence is actually much more than technical ability. You need that, but you also need much more in order to display your competence. So back to this slide, what I have been very interested in, and I want you to take a look at what you have on the right side, which has nothing to do with refugees, is to look into issues of penalty and how penalty and language come together. And what I'm theorizing and writing about, if I ever find time to finish my revisions in 2019, anyway, is how we move from the linguistic penalty to the penalty of difference, and the penalty that is already in place on the basis of ideological representations of the other that pre-exist any encounter and has already imposed a penalty on what is going to happen. Language is a site where who is in and who is to be kept out is negotiated on the basis of performance and ideology. And it is one of the few sites that it is out of the sort of policy frame, Equality Act, and it is enacted through the myth of fitting in. Okay, so fitting in is projected on the newcomer, and the newcomer is expected or given a little bit of time to acquire what is needed to convince the majority that they can fit in. And on that, I want to show you a video that was produced by Immigration New Zealand, and I'm referring here also to the work of very good outstanding collaborators, colleagues and friends, Janet Holmes and Meredith Mara, and the work we do together, which is actually to see how we can start challenging, how we can start imagining, designing alternative ways. Okay. So irrespective of whether what we do has to do with refugee integration, we all do processes of gatekeeping. And it is very important to also reflect how societal structure is perpetuated, resisted, or challenged through the work that we all do. And we have a very active role into that. So what I hope that I'm trying to convince you, if I haven't convinced you so far, is that language is very political. It is much more than words. It has to do with the embodied performance and the expectations that come into the various different contexts. And we could have looked into those issues from different starting points and angles. Job interviews are very interesting because they're supposed to be a proxy of what someone who is going to get the job can do. So if I perform well, then this is part of the evidence that I can perform well, irrespective of what it is that I'm going to do. Now, anybody in this room, I can actually really like the faces of those of you who have been in this process, and you know very well that there are a whole range of issues with this assumption of interviews as a proxy. What is also a very important issue that we don't have time to discuss is that pathways and initiatives, such as the one that has to do with integration, mobilize ideologies of the other, and therefore, ironically, often make it even more complex because we have to actually navigate what has already been projected on someone going through the gatekeeping event. So our language is very political. Exclusion and inclusion is everywhere around us. It is deeply ideological and to a great extent linguistically enacted. So where are we going from here? I think personally this is very problematic. I don't like what I see, and I think there is a need for alternative narratives. Alternative narratives, however, are very difficult, and in order to be able to introduce them, particularly in the current political context, where again we actually see a very anti-other as well as anti-expert, anti-university climate, is very difficult to achieve, and therefore I argue we need a different model of academic research, teaching, making our research known and relevant. The relationship between academics and the media is also a topic that could have been another course, let alone a lecture. And in closing, I'm going to just share a just quick snapshot of what happened when we published something that we co-authored with 2 colleagues in the conversation. It was very benign. Nothing particularly challenging, a little bit on, okay, monolingual ideal, but nothing particularly problematic and nowhere near deeply political issues such as the one that I'm raising. Immediately, we had comments such as this one. I'm not going to analyze them in great detail. I also had emails in my personal email. Academics are very public. Okay, we're very easily traceable. One saying that I'm a clever girl. Why am I wasting my time? The other saying that was deeply against my position and would write to the Vice-Chancellor to protest. So I was never envious of the Vice-Chancellor's inbox traffic, particularly if people write to express their views in agreement or disagreement. Having said that, however, there are important implications here about who controls what, the relationship between the media and how academics are positioned, how content is given and represented. Is it actually making an impact? And what is the role here? I strongly feel that I am in a university that is 100% behind me. I have absolutely no doubt that academic freedom and freedom of speech is protected. But what does this mean when we actually get to the society out there? What is that going to look like under the pressures that we see in the current socio-political environment? And also, if we are actually to challenge some of those views, how can we actually do that? And this is where I think we actually need a different way. We need a different way to work with all our collaborators. We need to move from this traditional transmission approach, which is still very common, to a more dynamic model that challenges static binaries that have been part of the way we conceptualize and operationalize our work for a very long time. So talking about teaching or research, talking about in-curricular or extracurriculum, academics or non-academics, local or national or international. This is out of sync with what we need if we are actually want to make a difference. And I don't have time to talk about the teaching-led research, but to me, I don't understand why we're talking about only research-led teaching when, for me, my experience is that I have learned and I do research with my students and I learn with my students and I work and learn with a whole range of other professionals that Chris very kindly introduced earlier. So on that, I'm going to just share with you a little bit of what we're trying to do in my wonderful department and the learning community we have created of students and staff working together across levels and programs. And I want to thank my department for giving me the opportunity and the honor to lead the design of our undergraduate community, and my colleagues and collaborators for being such a fantastic team and for seeing so many of them here tonight. So, I'm very fond of that. So what you actually have on the left is a group of students who were then first, second year undergraduate students. You have some PhD students. Most of the students, well, all the students but one who is in the picture is here tonight. And you also have members of academic and professional services staff working together in a student-led project, which the then undergraduate students presented as a prestigious conference. This is what I would like our learning communities to be. What is actually missing from that picture is what you have on the bottom on the right, which is a room which is full of non-academic stakeholders working around issues around language and migration. And what you have in the bottom, and on the bottom right is students, staff, policymakers, politicians, NGOs, members of the civil community coming together thinking, okay, this is not working the way we would want to work. How can we co-design? How can we co-own and start implementing some of the change that we want to see? And implementing the change we want to see is where I want to come to in the conclusion, because the question is, okay, where from here? And to answer this question, I'm going to first of all ask yet another question. And this photograph is from my last visit in New Zealand. I said that New Zealand has been a space of inspiration for me for many reasons. And this is from Te Papa, the National Museum, introducing a series of works from the 50s onwards, showing the stance of artists in contributing to social change. And the question that is asked on this slide is, in today's world, these works invite you to ask, where do I stand and where do I want to go? Last point. So you will allow me to answer this through sharing a personal narrative, something that most of you know that I don't do very often. And I will start by answering another question that many friends have asked me, which is why this inaugural now, over a year after the chair. So this has nothing to do with the wonderful WIHEA. Michelle called me with an amazing invitation only weeks after my promotion or elevation to a chair, if you want. It was, however, exactly the time I had lost my wonderful dad, who left very early and unexpectedly. This lecture is dedicated to him. His loss made me reflect a lot on what I do, why I do it, and where I'm going. In preparation of today, I have also been asking myself why my father would have wanted to be here today. Celebrate personal achievement, of course, but beyond that, I believe that what would have pleased him the most is how I use the privilege that my parents gave me, which is to empower me to believe that I can change the world, or at least the parts that I don't like, and that my voice matters. And to see how I serve those ideals and I try to make them relevant to others through my research and teaching. Universities are our students' academic homes and families, and as I see as our responsibility to enable them to do change. In the current political and economic environment and what is going to happen, this matters a lot. To conclude, I have dedicated my life to the academy, and I reconfirm to myself that I have made the right decision every day. I strongly believe, however, that academy needs to change in order to deliver education excellence and enable students to make a positive contribution to the complex world around us. This involves working in partnership with students, with colleagues across the university, nationally and internationally, as well as working in closer collaboration with non-academic stakeholders and policymakers. Looking back and looking forward, I have gained most reward from learning from and with my students, and from creating international research spaces where new ideas, practices, models flourish. Warwick is an excellent institution where we support creativity, and we can risk, therefore, doing things not because this is how we have always done it, but because this is what we think is the right thing to do and is what is needed right now. I intend to continue walking on this path, and I'm inviting you today to join me. Thank you.